everyone. Today is a special episode where we're going to go over the huge VCM report that was just released. So we finished that huge 26-hour 2-day conference, and Paul has just finished an almost 200-page Word document going through
You're
everything.
exaggerating, McKenna. It's only 175 pages.
Okay.
Only 175.
Well, but it covered so much from, transparency to project development, investment.
Yeah.
Can we just kind of go through just an introduction and tell me about like the supply constraints to start? That was a huge theme.
Yeah, sure. So the way we went about it is sort of the way we go about all of our intelligence here at Climate Transform, where our whole thing revolves around the interviews themselves. So 26 hours of interviews and panels from everyone from the ICVCM board to Maggie Kim, the CEO of Gold Standard, David Antonioli, the CEO of Vera. But we had Microsoft, we had Standard Chartered, we had Carbon Growth Partners, we had 75 speakers in total that were sort of front and center with developing the sort of the guts of this report. And I had a relatively simple job, which was writing the first 10 pages. And I know that sounds like a big job, but it really wasn't when you just get to sit down and go through the incredible intelligence that was generated from these 26 hours of interviews. And so what was clear, McKenna, from the whole thing from day one is we chose this title of VCM, a gold rush. And the reason I chose the phrase gold rush, which, by the way, everybody hated. Everyone had a reason to hate the expression of gold rush because people didn't like it because it sounds like you're trying to profit from the climate. And people also hated it because it said that there were, it shone the infrastructure, the picks and shovels, the ecosystem in a really bad light. And all of that was true to some degree, right? So I knew if everybody hated the topic, we were onto the right. We got it right. And literally, if you think about gold rushes from California in the 1840s, they were filled with tremendous opportunity, but a lack of regulation, a lack of transparency. You had service providers that made copious amounts of money. You had fortunes made and fortunes lost. And that's the VCM today. The VCM is, creaking at the seams in terms of its pending growth. Its inefficiencies are holding it back. It is filled with well-intentioned folks who have a real mission in terms of the businesses that they've started in support of the VCM. And there's a few dodgy people on the side who will eventually be weeded out. So that's how we sort of thought about it. So in fact, my job after reading through these reports and listening to all these interviews was relatively straightforward. And we came up with a bunch of conclusions about what we think will drive what I think will drive the VCM, in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a huge project, and I'm excited that people can use this going forward as kind of a metric for next steps and everything. And look, we all know how impactful VCM can be, despite any kind of controversy in it. So where are all the $billion checks to fund it?
Yeah, so one of the things which is clear with the VCM, so the VCM is going to be it'll be a $2 billion market this year, right? So that's the extent of it. Now McKinsey thinks it should be a $50 billion market by 2030, and that's what gets everyone super excited about the marketplace, right? So, but there is a real problem with the funding of new, particularly nature-based projects. And I think about this very simply. If the opportunities are so great, and this is a $50 trillion marketplace, and we know how important it is to ring-fence the Amazon or to utilize, Microsoft is a very good example of an organization that is spending a lot of time investing in projects in mangroves in Africa and cookstove projects. Microsoft did 1.3 million tons of carbon offset last year. It's nothing in the greater scheme of things, right? And my question to all of this, when the biggest asset management firm dedicated to VCM is less than $300 million, which in the asset management world is a rounding error, right? and you're right. Where are the billion-dollar checks? Where's the Al endowment? Where's the PIF from Saudi Arabia? Where is sovereign wealth funds from all around the world? Where are they? Why aren't they putting money into the system? And the reason they're not putting money in the system is because of these structural problems that still overwhelm the VCM in terms of transparency and benchmarking, and baselines, and just the opaqueness of the system as a whole. I mean, after the event, we had a conversation with Fallow, the Web3 company, which talked about pre-financing. And they made the point in that white paper that if you had a fully digitized process, the VCM is a remarkably analog process at the moment. But if you had a fully digitized process, project developers could probably double the amount of credits they could release. And they think that currently around $2.6 billion is being held back just due to efficiency. So it's not uncommon for brokers and middlemen to take up to 30% of the fees in regards to across the life of a project. McKenna, for basically doing nothing. And that's just because of a lack of transparency in price, a lack of transparency in what you're getting, a lack of transparency is a ton of carbon actually a ton of carbon. And I think that's the reason for me that the billion-dollar checks aren't being written.
Absolutely. And one thing that I believe you brought up was to scaling up the liquidity of all of this is standardization. Could you go into what obstacles are in the way of making that a reality?
So this is the $64 billion question, right? So it depends on how you think about the VCM, right? So there is a school of thought that, and particularly led by investment banks and brokers who have spent their entire their lives building out products requiring standardization, right? So if you have standardization, everybody can understand it, makes the addressable market that much bigger, right? Makes loads of sense. The trouble is that a standard VCM credit, Cookstove credit, nature-based solution, RED Plus, LED project, renewables in some places, it makes it look much more like corporate credit, where you can go and buy corporate bonds in JP Morgan or Google. Now they're both corporate bonds, but JP Morgan and Google are very different companies and have very, very different risk metrics to assess them. The VCM should look that way. And there's a reason that corporate credit doesn't have liquid futures markets and standardization around them. There's benchmarking and all that sort of thing, which can be applicable to VCM, but it's not easy to standardize this stuff, right? So, and the fear that people have, and gold standard's been very front and center of this, if you do standardize them, if you make them all look very, very similar, then suddenly it's a race to the fear is, I fear, gold standard, I fear it's a race to the bottom of just getting, how do I get a ton of carbon to offset my net zero pledges, right? And suddenly all the STGs and the benefits to communities that have been the cornerstone of VCM for the last 20 years, I think they're under threat. And that's a natural consequence of standardization. And frankly, that is something that the brokers, investment banks, and liquidity providers can't answer. Right? Do the STGs get pushed to one side? Now, they naturally say they don't, but you can't have standardization of a product into futures markets, forward curves, all that sort of thing that you need to have a scaled market, with all these very different STGs sort of on the side. I struggle with that notion. I think it's bound to happen. I think it eventually leads to VCM looking much more like just pure carbon products, like in compliance markets. Now, if that's the case, that's where VCM and compliance merge under Article 6, and suddenly, the VCM in the form that we know it, probably, we'll put it under that model. It sort of is very, very different. I'm not saying it goes away, but it's very different to what we see today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something that came up a lot during that conference was creating these projects and what do they look like? What standards are there and all that? What's acceptable and encouraged? Can you talk a little bit more about the core carbon principles guiding all of this? Because that will be so key as these keep getting created.
Yeah, I think the core carbon principles are literally a set of principles, again, which are designed to move towards standardization. But I think there's a first step, and the first step is the VCM is really confusing, and the VCM is really confusing because there's 130 registries, there's 500 MRVs, measurement companies, there's set scientific standards and all this sort of stuff. If you're new to the VCM, you haven't got a bloody clue what's going on, right? It's really confusing, right? And particularly given the analog process that it can take 2 years for a project to get verified, right? And that just doesn't cut it in the world that we're in, all right? And the urgency around all of this. So I think that the core carbon principles are a natural first step to standardization. Now, they've faced a lot of criticism. David Antonioli recently was very critical of the core carbon principles. I think they're an essential step to bridge that divide between standardization and scale, and still keeping the SDGs, which are an important part of what people do. I think the ICVCM who are conducting these a consultation on the core carbon principles, which is still going on, and I think has got a little finishes relatively soon. It's a really important part of the standardization process, and frankly, I can't see how standardization doesn't occur without the core carbon principles being embraced.
Yeah, because what else is everyone going to do?
They'll do what they're doing today and go off and do their own thing, right? And they'll have their own standards and the like. And particularly when, you've got governments around the world which are becoming more and more engaged, I'll put it engaged, in terms of protecting these carbon assets as a sovereign asset, right? There's talk that the new Lula government in Brazil is going to get together and form a cartel of carbon credits with Gabon and Indonesia and the like, and that would change it, and that would change everything. So I think that for me, that's one of the key things that we need to be looking at about what sort of leadership is going to come out of Brazil in regards to carbon markets, because the VCM under around Article 6 and the like, it's very much a country. The countries themselves will drive that. That's what the Paris Accords all about, in terms of allowing sovereign nations to drive their own standards and the like. And I think it's going to be to have that anchor around core carbon principles, that globally we can accept that if we buy a credit, it's going to be based on those sort of really clearly defined principles. I think that's super important.
Absolutely. And could you just go over how you think, Web3 will play into all of this, and what is that leaking into of this?
Yeah, I think the web. I'm a deep blockchains. Well, I'm certainly a massive crypto skeptic. I'm a bit smug right now because obviously I'm being proven right, but neither here nor there. The blockchain is, I think, in a lot of industries, a solution looking for a problem. It's a really elegant solution for the VCM, which is a complicated analog system that requires incredible amounts of tracing and monitoring of so many different factors. It's a really elegant solution for this. Now, I think that the criticism that the registries get about being behind the curve on this is justified to a point, but I cannot name another industry that is doing as wider levels of consultation about every facet of its ecosystem and whether it can embrace blockchain than what the VCM is. I think Vera and Gold Standard deserve a lot of credit for what they're doing, and more importantly, that the criticism that they're getting for not moving quickly enough, I think is harsh, because they are doing a lot to embrace blockchain as that tool. Now, Web3 companies they've got a huge problem right now, and it's got nothing to do with what they're doing. The Web3 companies that we speak to, whether it's Sencan, Toucan, Fallow, all of them. Forgive me for the ones I missed out on, right? But I can't name them all, because we've met a lot of incredibly mission-driven companies that are morally sound. I mean, remember our conversation with Dana from Flow Carbon, right? Just really their hearts and corporate. Their North Star is where it needs to be, right? Crypto is their problem. right? The FTX bankruptcy did more harm to Web3 companies in the VCM space than anything that Vera and Gold Standard have ever done, right? So look, they've got a reputational problem now because their volumes are going to dry up near term because people don't trust blockchain in the aggregate, right? And that's a problem for them. So I think that they've got to work extra hard to convince the world, rightly so, that they are a very elegant and long-term sound solution to the problems of the VCM.
And we have these kind of, solutions with blockchain and like the core, principles and whatnot, and just seeing how policy plays into it. Can you go over, the scope 3 disclosure requirements and how that also?
Yeah, people are viewing this as a little bit of a holy grail for demand, right? So I think that there's oodles of demand out there for high quality credits. I just don't think we have enough high quality credits, right? So I think again, going back to the $1 billion check, this is a scenario where high quality supply will allow demand to come in, and that's your hyper growth for the market. But you've got to have that supply around. You've got to get that supply funded. We need more capital in the business to drive the supply that will feed the demand, right? So, but there is this holy grail which people have talked about, which is Scope 3 disclosure requirements by the SEC, which is effectively there's a consultation which is again ending very, very soon, where the SEC in all likelihood next year will mandate that US public companies are required to disclose their Scope 3 emissions. And the argument is very simple. If your Scope 3 emissions are public record and you've made a net zero pledge, you've got to be seen to be moving towards that net zero pledge. And how do you do it if you can't decarbonize your supply chain through technology reasons? You buy offsets, right? Very simple, very valid argument. But I think that there is some real prospects that Scope 3 emissions disclosures don't come in. I think it's likely to be challenged by the Supreme Court in a similar, under a states' rights issue, in a similar vein to what the EPA was defanged back earlier this year. So I think, look, if it does come through and it is implemented, it is a boost to demand for the VCM, undeniably so, right? I'm skeptical whether it does come through because you've got a fairly, I'll be diplomatic here, an activist Supreme Court that is prioritizing states' rights, and this could well fall by the way as the same as the EPA did earlier this year.
Absolutely. And I guess we'll see what happens, right? And how that actually does come to fruition.
Yeah, it's hard to see how it's not going to get challenged. I mean, it's US politics for us, right? It's hard to see how the challenge doesn't come about. I think it is. Look, I think a lot of companies are going to volunteer to do it anyway. I think they'll volunteer to do it anyway. So I think there's going to be organic. Look, organic demand organically is going to rise over time, right? Particularly if you've got a supply chain that is hard to abate, steel, cement, airline shipping, and if you don't fall under compliance markets where you're compelled to buy offsets, the voluntary markets are a really great way to do that, right? In a really elegant way, and that's why you find companies like Shell, BP, and Exxon, who are caught up in compliance markets, in particularly in their European jurisdictions, are still buying VCM on top of that to offset US emissions where they don't fall under California RIGA or other state-driven compliance credit requirements.
So I know we went over a few different aspects of the whole VCM today. Could you just kind of give me a summary of what are the biggest takeaways from this entire conference and amount, like after downloading all of this information, and what are steps overall?
Yeah, I think, look, for me, I think the current state of the VCM is, I use the word dysfunctional, and I frankly don't think it's too harsh. It doesn't function well. It doesn't function well because of the lack of transparency. There are slews of companies that are trying to fix that transparency issue using blockchain, using price discovery, using a slew of different things. That will improve over time. We do have a funding problem, as Thallo alluded to in their white paper. We do have a supply problem, which means there's a lot of low quality supply. Our friends at Carbon Growth Partners made the point that if you take out all the REDD+ projects, which were 40% of roughly potentially 20% of all projects with dodgy baselines, and that's a black eye for the industry about how bad the baselines were in those initial REDD+ programs. Plus the fact that Vera and Gold Standard are not issuing credits on renewables anymore outside of the LDCs. Suddenly you're left with about 40% of the original credits. And the supply, it works out to be the available unretired credits outstanding now are about 4% of the world's energy consumption, right? We have a massive supply shortage. And the only way that improves is through funding improvement and the like, and high quality and allowing high quality projects, which will be driven at scale by greater digitization, greater funding greater funding of pre-financing deals to get things off the ground. That's that sort of thing. Look, we need technology is a big solution to this. We need a meta registry, like the World Bank is working on a meta registry, which is effectively a collation of all the 130 registries into one, which will be, if you can have that as open architecture that people can access, a huge advantage, right? Price discovery and a functioning forward curve, which the core carbon principles certainly move that towards standardization. Again, we debated before about whether you can how much standardization you can have in the VCM, but a degree of standardization will give you a forward curve of, and that forward curve will give investors confidence that I can extract these cash flows over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 plus years, right? Again, a really important development. Look, we need to grow the VCM, and the VCM needs more capital, and that capital will allow liquidity to grow. So all of these Web3 companies, but all the exchanges, all the investment banks, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Standard Chartered, they all want to get into the space and provide liquidity, which is what they do best, to their corporate clients who are looking for VCM and carbon related solutions. So at the end of the day, throw capital. We need, all things come back to how much capital we have in it. Capital is really important, but that capital will only come if we solve the dysfunctional elements of the absence of transparency and questioning over additionality and baselines and all that sort of thing.
Well, thank you so much for going through all of this. And it's a really exciting time for VCM and a lot of changes to come. Everyone who's listening, you can go to www.climatetransform.com to potentially get access to this report. Well,
I think we can. Everyone gets access to this because we don't have this. There's no paywall for this one. Everyone gets access to this report. It's 175 pages of bedtime reading. Again, just go through it. There's some great content in there across all of the 26 hours of panels that we did. I should explain the structure of the report is, I did a little synopsis at the start. Forget that, but go in there and actually read the summaries of each of the 26 hours of interviews, and it's worthwhile.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the report.